Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our 7th online webinar. The title this evening is Productivity, the Silver Bullet to Net Zero Carbon. So very quickly, 2020 Focus by Farmers, sponsored by EIT Food, basically happened since obviously the restrictions due to COVID. We haven't been able to get on farm and carry out our farm walks. So where we've been doing is we've carried out this the 7th webinar to upskill and demonstrate best practice on our ABP farmers. We've been very lucky in being able to use Sam Chesney and James Evans, who will hear at the end of the webinar, where they've been showing best practice on farm and the technology they've been adopting. You will hear from Jonathan in a minute, who will introduce the speakers. But firstly, I'd like to hand you over to Professor Nigel Scollin, who would like to say a few words.
So, colleagues, tonight I'd just like to share a few words with you to acknowledge the passing of a dear friend and colleague to many in the farming industry across the United Kingdom and Ireland. Conor very sadly passed away on Friday, the 27th of November. A friend to many, and also very much a friend to this series of EIT Food webinars. Conor was known as a pioneer of lean farming techniques and ran a mixed farm with a pedigree herd of Salers and combinable crops as part of a family partnership in Northumberland. Conor had an extraordinary passion and vision and enthusiasm for advancing farming. Our thoughts are very much with his loved ones.
Okay, thank you very much, Nigel, for your tribute to Conor. We will miss him. We'll miss his enthusiasm, his dynamism, and his ideas. So just thank you for acknowledging that. Now, we're now moving on really to the focus topic for this meeting. Very much the part that productivity can play in delivering net zero in farming. Thank you firstly all for coming to this meeting. Thank you for making the effort. We hope you enjoy it and take away a number of ideas that can perhaps be applied to your farm or be useful to your business. But it's good to have you involved, and thank you for being here. We've got a really dynamic speaker lineup for tonight, and we're very, very grateful to each one of them for actually participating in the meeting tonight. They've probably had to put quite a bit of effort into it, but it's definitely well worth having them here. So I'm going to introduce each one of them to you, and then I'm going to just basically run through how the meeting will run tonight and how it will be handled so that you understand what's coming there. But our four speakers, as you can see, are Peter Kendall and Nick Whelan, Stuart Roberts and Victor Chestnut. And just to give you a little bit of background on them, Peter is now back to his primary title being farmer again. He was president of the National Farmers Union from 2006 until 2014. He has served as the president of the World Farmers Organization, and until recently was the chairman of the Agriculture and Horticulture Development Board, and hence his involvement as well with the Agricultural Productivity Working Group and the Food and Drink Sector Council, which will be explained later on as well. He's now spending most of his time, although I'm pretty sure not all of it, on running the family farm in partnership with his brother. His farm is located just north of London. He's going to tell you a little bit about it in a while, but it's focusing on the production of a range of crops as well as broiler production. And he's a very practical farmer now, and he is trying to apply a lot of what we're talking about tonight on his own unit. So you will have the opportunity to listen, but also to question him and ask him about what he is doing in particular. And then he's going to outline the importance of productivity and just walk through a lot of the definitions, the need for it, that type of thing. So that's Peter. Then we have Stuart, who's NFU Deputy President, and he is also a practical farmer, farming in Hertfordshire in partnership with his wife, and he is a third generation arable and livestock farmer, and he's also worked for DEFRA and the Food Standards Agency, and he's also held senior management roles within the meat supply chain, so he knows the chain up and down, and he is also going to talk around the implementation of the strategy and how it's moving forward in GB. So we're grateful to have Stuart as well. And then moving on to Nick. Nick has a stellar CV, having worked through a number of very good organisations, and he's now Chief Executive of Dale Farm, but he's also worked as a Commercial Director of Glanbia Ingredients, and the previous 9 years before that at Kerry Foods as well. And he has been heavily involved with Food and Drink Sector Council since its inception and the Agricultural Productivity Working Group, and he's very focused on how we're going to increase that productivity across Northern Ireland, and he's going to talk about that and the implications and the rollout as well. Lastly, then we're moving on to Victor. Victor is Ulster Farmers Union President, again, another farmer, and essentially heavily involved in livestock enterprises, pedigree textile sheep, as we're representing the farmers in Northern Ireland as well. So we're glad to have Victor as well. So those are the key speakers, and we're very glad to have you. So just to give, before we hand over to Peter to do his presentation, just to give you a feel for what's happening, Peter's going to do about a 20-minute presentation, and then Stuart, Nick and Victor are going to do about 3 to 5 minutes each in response to that, and expanding a little bit on what Peter says. And then we're going to really head into 30 minutes or so of discussion. If it runs on a bit, that's fine. It depends on the level of interest. And then finally, we're going to finish with summaries from two farmers, James Evans and Sam Chesney, who will obviously give a little bit of a practical implication of what does it really mean for people on the ground and what are they doing about it. So no further ado, we're going to hand over to Peter. And again, just thank you for coming, Peter, and we'll let you go from here.
Hi, thank you very much indeed, Jonathan, Jason, as well, Rankin, for inviting me, and AgResearch for involving me in your discussion this evening. I am, as Jonathan said right at the start, throwing myself actually into practical farming now with actually a rejuvenation, if you like, from too long spent on trains into London or flights around the United Kingdom or being involved in European farming bodies and what have you. And yes, it's a difficult time to be in farming, but that's my rather unremarkable part of East Bedfordshire, looking across there that I farm with my brother. I know one or two people on there will know that part of the world. We're 15 miles from Cambridge. But it is unforgiving, flat, horrible clay. I don't know if you can see me, but I had a great uncle who wrote land drainage books and described how the only thing that kept them from the workhouse in the early 1900s was actually keeping the surplus water off that arable land. And from an early age, it's been instilled on me that with the main ditch that runs through our farm having 1 foot fall in a mile, this is challenging land. I say that because what I want to touch on in the next 20 minutes or so is that every farm has unique aspects. And if we're not careful, we convince ourselves that we can't compare what we're doing with what other people are doing because of our unique circumstances. And I think it's really, really important that as we look at net zero, the changes that are occurring to agricultural support, the challenges that are charging down the road towards us, that we don't look at our farming business and say, but I'm unique. Because as I say with my picture there, I can make lots of excuses about my farm and why that doesn't apply, but I think it really would be a really poor mistake. Look, I'm talking with I suppose the hat of farmer definitely this evening. I can say that I've got a lot of experience from my time at the NFU and make sure Roberts, who's coming on next, feel incredibly nervous. Because of that, I'm very conscious of how messaging needs to be really carefully thought out when we're looking at periods of massive change. And again, because of my involvement and my agricultural career, the NFU has been my first love, without any shadow of a doubt, of my involvement in an organisation. That's really what gave me such an insight into the industry, whether it's Northern Ireland or in Shropshire or the southwest of the United Kingdom. That's been just a massive highlight. But it does give you an insight into the challenge of communication and how you get across those messages. 6 years involved with AHDB taught me, again, more of those challenges of communication, of how you have to steer people, you can't force people into changes. And it also, and I know Stuart Roberts would share this, the challenges of sometimes working with government make that also difficult. I put the picture up there of the intensive, in inverted commas, broiler farm that we built since I finished doing the NFU. I was conscious that I'd disappeared off the family farm for the best part of 14 years, doing deputy president and president of the NFU, and coming home into the family business and just saying to my brother, I want to go back to doing the crop walking and the spraying and what have you. And, you know, you're going to make some more room for me. Probably wouldn't have been tactful even by my own unique standards. So wanting to come back and do something that actually complemented, and my children get bored of me talking about synergies, but sort of creating a business that complemented the rest of the farming system was something we chose to do. We built those first 4 poultry houses in 2016. The last 4 on the left-hand side were completed only in February of this year. It's given me a really good insight into how you performance measure, the technology in perpetual measurement of performance of a farming business. I joke with some regularity that when Sir Lockwood Smith was the High Commissioner from New Zealand in London, he would stand on platforms in Wales or Scotland or probably even in Northern Ireland. When talking to beef and sheep farmers, he'd go, I'm not your enemy from New Zealand. Peter Kendall with his wretched poultry sheds are your enemy. He's the one that you need to see off. But again, the poultry industry has given me a completely fresh insight into measuring performance. And that's something I will want to touch on in the next few minutes. I think we're talking this evening about productivity and climate change and net zero. And look, I absolutely endorse Manette Batters and her ambition for net zero, the NFU's challenge to be net zero by 2040. I just think for an industry to be on the front foot, to be pushing really hard to look at the innovation required, the changing in farmers' practices to make that happen, and stating it early has given the NFU, I think, influence in a way that it hasn't had for a long time. It's emphatically on the front foot with environmental groups. And I think we have the opportunity to make a real impact with government if we're prepared to meet the challenge. And I think the balancing act here is how we view that challenge, and whether we, go back to my first slide of my flat, heavy land, do we make excuses for what we can or can't do, or do we energetically look for solutions? Because I do believe that climate change, I've got teenage children, you can't hear them careering around the house around me, but they're somewhere and they might erupt at some point. But for my teenage children, climate change is the biggest issue that we face as a global society. That net zero carbon is enormous in how we achieve it as an industry. And I think it's going to be overpowering in British agriculture for the foreseeable future in how we find solutions to it. Agricultural productivity, and why is it so important? And I'm really conscious that, we when we talk, and the guys of you there who are regularly sitting and talking in front of farmers know that if you're not careful, you can so quickly alienate everybody when you say we've got to improve our productivity. It's not working harder message, it's trying to work smarter. I did a presentation to some New Zealanders a couple of months ago, and one of them chirped up and said they'd just done this survey on farmers in New Zealand, and something like, I think it was 82% of New Zealand farmers felt they were in the top 25% in being the most efficient. Well, we know that's not right. I think I've seen similar figures for the UK as a whole as well. It is a challenge. It's almost like, affronting someone when you say, you've got to up your game, you've got to act smarter. Jonathan and I worked on some of these slides together. And yes, productivity, increasing output with the same inputs, maintaining output for reduced input. There could even be a third in there where you actually reduce output, but you reduce your inputs by even more of a corresponding amount. I don't think we have to be fixated on that output as a whole. And I do think that language, and it's why I would plead to Stuart and others that we need to get the language right on this, because it is such a thorny issue to grab, I think, for the industry when you say we can do better without thinking it's about getting up earlier, it's spending more hours on the tractor, more hours in the milking parlour or whatever. It's got to be working smarter. And look, it's not just the productivity's impact for climate change that's so important. Look, I'm long in the tooth, as my kids would tell you very, very quickly. I was 60 this year. So I've seen quite a lot of change in the farming world over the last 40 years. I've been joking with some of my university mates only recently that it was 41 years since we first gathered at Nottingham University, and I came home to farm in 1984. I've seen enormous change, but I don't think I've ever seen such a rapid coming together of issues that face the farming industry. Yes, we've had some announcements on CAP, and boy, for someone who's stepped back from the political fray, that the involvement in all of this in recent months, trying to get my head around what's happening in Northern Ireland, in Wales, in Scotland, let alone for my own farm business, you can see why people glaze over. But I think the NFU is absolutely right to be really kind of blunt that we do not know enough details about where we're going. Despite the COVID lockdown, I do still have a chance to gather and talk with farmers occasionally. And so few people have really understood that cutting back of support. And I did the figures on our farm only recently, and it's not 50% by 2024. It's actually 60% reduced by 2024. And I really don't think many farmers have started to address that at this moment in time. Taking that support out makes my profitability on the arable side really pretty meagre, if existent at all. We know that the leaving of the European Union, there is every eventuality, every chance that we'll face more competition with the imported produce. We know the challenges from society about our environmental impact. I had to panically cultivate some broadcast wheating on some of our farm, where we've direct drilled, and if I can have a chance later on, talk a bit more about direct drilling into cover crops. Where we've done that, we've had very little water runoff. Where we've moved the ground, the ditches are running brown this morning. Almost, I said to my son as I was driving around, almost with embarrassment, the way we'd cultivated, you could see the colour of the ditches, drainage ditches, really running quite brown because of it. The last point as well is, and it's one of the things I'll talk about in the recommendations later on, we need to find a way helping people through this period of massive change. We know, and I applaud Stuart, the different farming organisations again for how they've made mental health a really big issue, but we do need to recognise there's a lot of people very isolated, really quite, I think, daunted by the changes that are coming down the road towards them, and how we get people together to make them realise they're not on their own, and productivity that can be done through working smarter can make their life more interesting, more fun, is really critical for me. So that's why I think we have to address it. But if I go to the next couple of slides, quite quickly, I've got a couple of ones here. If you can't see them very clearly, the bottom line is agricultural labour productivity from the UK sitting at the bottom. I'm going back to my previous example about my heavy land. We can always make excuses why the UK is different. And you can see again, the UK, I'm sorry, the HDB's changed the colours on the slides here, but this time again in green at the bottom is the UK, and that's total factor productivity, all our inputs equaling output. Look at the levelling out we've achieved over those critical years. And this doesn't change massively if you bring in the last few years onto that slide. I'm using my old slides from my AHDB's days in this, but the message is very clear. Other countries around the world have been stealing a march on us here in the UK. Things need to change. And when we look at what those other countries on that slide, and I'm sure Jonathan can share those slides with anybody else who wants to see them afterwards. That's total productivity. The second bullet point, where I showed that if the UK over the last 15 years, the productivity growth has been 0.9% per year, compared to 3.5% in the Netherlands, 3.2% in the USA. Now, the staggering thing is if you were growing our productivity the same as the Netherlands, for example, and I get all the arguments about the intensity of their production, their horticultural sector, et cetera, but the difference that would make would be, getting on for replacing the BPS payments over that next 10 years if we could achieve it. So the prize is absolutely enormous. The need to address productivity as an industry has never been bigger. We know, and look, I sit there as somebody, I'm sure many of you looked at those open fields of East Anglia, which I showed in the first slide. I think, well, those guys don't need support. I can promise you, in the arable sector, it knocks a massive hole in your returns. The changes of me trying to rethink how I farm as these changes are all hurtling towards us. I know that I have to look at the productivity in our farming business. I've tried really hard over recent times to look at how we can complement that large broiler business with the arable business at the same time. But what I do know for certain, and this is the bit that I think we all need to think hard about in the language, is business as usual isn't going to be an option. And that background here is what led us to the Food and Drink Sector Council. So look, it's that background of change that led a group of people interested in the food industry to initially, work independently, but then ultimately end up forming and creating the Food and Drink Sector Council. It was never ideal. It was a bit of self-appointed people from within the industry to start with, but then it did get adopted as part of the industrial strategy by both BEIS and DEFRA within government to say, actually, we did want a Food and Drink Sector Council, mirroring many other councils that came together from different sectors of the economy to say, how do we make the most of the government's industrial strategy? How do we grow that sector? How do we improve its performance? The group was set up, after that initial start of, what might be argued to be, a few noisy people from within the industry, to be one that was, really representative of the entire food industry. And that's why Nick Whelan, who's still involved in it and much better versed in this than me, is involved and a very influential member of that group as well, was pulled together to try and make sure government had a voice to talk to from across the food industry. It's been bogged down, obviously, in Brexit, in difficult areas. And we've had times where we've been able to go back and look, I left this back at the turn of the year, times when there's been a real ability to communicate direct with government and give messages across. You wonder, and I can make a political comment now, I do wonder, with what's happened around Brexit, whether they've listened at all, because boy, has there been a very clear message of the importance of a deal over the last few weeks. And I was communicating with Jonathan over the weekend, thinking this evening might be absolutely torpedoed by a no-deal Brexit announcement at that point. But look, that was the background to the Food and Drink Sector Council. It is that formal partnership I talked about that was really clear. It was made up eventually from formal representatives from across the industry. And it's really important to make sure that, and I don't need to read all those points across, is how we got across the government, what aspects we needed, what elements we needed to create that successful sector that was. And again, the frustration from so many of us was the government doesn't seem to recognise the importance of this sector to the economy, the number of jobs, the potential for growth, the potential for exports, and actually getting this formal voice was something that was really critical, something we felt very strongly about. So the target areas, and we made some obviously mistakes. I'm not going to pretend for a moment that we didn't make mistakes. We probably created too many working parties. We tried to, at times, and you can be guilty of almost trying to boil the ocean. And we probably spread our net too widely in looking at lots of different areas. But we did then try and concentrate them. And Jonathan Burney, our chairman for this evening, was brilliant at helping focus the thinking into these key areas that we wanted to touch on. I think wherever I go now, the talk of data and the collection of data and how it's used on farm is really critical. I think the discussion around knowledge exchange and how that occurs is being repeatedly talked about in almost every avenue, every space I find myself in. How we get the right research, and then again, how do we get the right infrastructures in place? I'll leave my last point really to the next summary of recommendations, if I could. I'm going to go back to my slide, and one of the reasons for showing you my slide of the broiler sheds. every 7 weeks, I get a league table that shows me how I'm performing in my broiler business. I can see really clearly, what my food conversion rate is, what my mortality in 7 days is over the whole crop, what ultimately my pence per metre squared per week is. The benefit that gives to the 3 guys who have working on the farm, when they sit down with my brother and I, we sit there. When we have a really good crop and we're near the top, we're really buoyant. When we're halfway down, we're sitting there really eager to try and understand what's gone wrong. And I do think, and this is something that people get nervous about. I made that point again about, having a flat, heavy land farm that you can't really, or I can make excuses about. We have to be prepared to hold that mirror up, to look at our businesses and not say you can't compare me with this person or that person, because actually if people are doing things better, more efficiently, more effectively, we ought to want to learn, but we also really critically need to know where we sit. And going back to that point I made earlier on about the New Zealanders, 82% of them thinking they're in the top 25%, I think there's a massive tendency in farming to think we're just a bit better than we are. And when people do say where you sit, to probably make excuses about it. I might be stepping over the mark here. But when we use this, I would like to see when government are using support mechanisms over the coming years to really strongly, whether it's strongly incentivizing or compelling in some shape or form, getting farmers to start doing that sort of benchmarking, whether you call it benchmarking, whatever you call it, get people analysing their businesses. And I'd go further as well and say get people together in whether they're benchmarking clubs or discussion groups or whatever they are. Why? Because I think that creates, one, a forum for people to get together. And we talked about I talked about social welfare, the challenges that are coming in this period of enormous change, getting people together rather than sitting at home with a pile of invoices on the corner of your desk thinking, Christ, I can't see my way out of this, realizing other people are facing exactly the same problems. They might be wanting to share machinery or make a change that you can work together on. So that use of data, I think, is absolutely pivotal to this change on productivity, to trying to, where we start discussing how we might meet the net zero challenge, rather than being stuck at home with a bombardment of leaflets or webinars or whatever, having that chance to sit with other people who are equally perplexed by what this might mean, I think is really important. So I do see that as the foundation stone. The other point we felt in the UK, in the Food and Drink Sector Council, was transforming knowledge exchange. And one of the points that we felt, and I'm going to use, and I apologise because I know I'm talking primarily a beef and sheep and dairy sort of forum here probably. But for me as an arable farmer, I'm convinced that we're in the process of moving from a chemical-based agriculture to a systems-based biological agriculture. And I'm just scratching my head, trying to work out where that financial edge is with the people who come down the drive flogging me cans of chemical or quick fix solutions with antibiotics. We've got to find system solutions that are smart going forward and will help us reduce that carbon footprint. So there was a very strong recommendation for creating the evidence for farming that we felt would be that central hub where people could get work recognised, approved, and we would know as farmers this was the best way of getting or approaching a certain challenge that's coming our way. The third bit that came out of the recommendations was, accelerated targeted innovation. And I hope I don't offend anyone, on the webinar this evening. But look, there's a really strong view that, the UK government piles millions and millions, in excess of £400 million into agriculture R&D. And we just don't think, or we felt very strongly that there was not enough clarity about what the big challenge is. I would start with the theme for this evening, net zero. Where is that priority being given? In antibiotic resistance, in sort of some of the disease or resistance we have in weeds in my arable sector as well. There could be some very clear targeted innovations rather than some scientists making a pitch for innovation around the areas they already have an expertise and interest in. So for me, it's really important that we identify as a collective industry, and this is for you guys now, not for me to be involved in, what those really big challenges are, and then how do we accelerate, magnify the bangs for bucks in those really critical areas. The drive for uptake of training and professional development, Stuart will be able to say more on this, I'm sure, but it's really great to see DEFRA are finally getting, I think, to put some money towards and funding some sort of work around professional training and development. Again, I'd like to be bolder still. And I think this happens in Northern Ireland already. When I look at examples of France, where if you want to get grants to develop or improve productivity, you have to demonstrate some skill and training and professionalism. Tough one, I know, for membership organizations, but I do think that if we're going to have investment into new technological solutions, more systems-based solutions, we need to demonstrate that we have the ability to do that. And, I think the notion of just saying that, well, I've always done it that way, I know how to carry on. We are ultimately putting food on people's children's plates, customers' plates. And I think we need to be able to stand up and say we're professional, we've got training, and we've got the skills to make sure we move forward. The last recommendation from the group was around rural enablers. And I think when we look at meeting net zero, the fact that we can see ourselves, I think, with more robotics, more remote sensing, we might have a significant amount of scanning of the landmass area to understand more about greenhouse gas emissions. If we haven't got that 5G capability, if we haven't got a point the NFU in England and Wales make about connectivity through decent electricity schemes, so if we are creating renewable energy on farms that can be got out onto grids, there's a lot that if we are going to meet that net zero as a farming industry, we need to have connectivity, and that's not just digital, it's electric, it's right the way across the board, that we can't just be abandoned in some of those rural areas. And I do think when I talk about rural enablers, I see a monumental period of change, whether it is insect protein, whether it is vertical farms, the whole use of byproducts to create plant nutrients, etc. It's going to be a really period of excitement for me. So that rural enablers is really, really critical. Just I'll leave you with one last slide of a cover crop. Stuart Roberts, who's known me for a long time, now, because there's Peter Kendall, sort of intensive arable man from the flatlands of East Bedfordshire, growing cover crops, and it's something we are looking at on our business, and whether elms will compensate me or reward me for growing cover crops. We've got to the point where we're banging our head against the brick wall on our farm, growing break crops that we couldn't control blackgrass in. They were too high risk with high temperatures in the summer. We weren't making money. We are looking now how we can improve our soils, reduce our overheads. We're determined to reduce our overheads significantly to do this. But it's like, for me, and it's what I'm going to finish on now, if I may, it's like I'm learning from scratch. And I'm sitting down with my agronomist, and I did this morning. We've almost got to forget what we've done in the past. And that's why I think learning from other people, pulling ourselves together, learning from other people, what other countries are doing around the world is really important. So look, the AgriSearch, the events you're holding this evening, making people think, but giving people the opportunity to come together and think, Christ, I'm not the only person thinking along these lines. I'm not the only person facing these challenges is really important. So look, apologies for a bit of a farmer ramble. My professionalism of days of working at HDB are long behind me now. That's me as a farmer saying, boy, have we got a lot coming our way, and we need to collaborate to find a way through it.
Good. Thank you, Peter. Really appreciate that. And you've certainly generated enough interest, because there's 19 questions at the minute. So I say the panel will be working hard tonight. But can I just hand over now to Stuart? Again, Stuart, thank you for joining us. We'll hand over to you just to really have just 3 to 5 minutes, really just explaining where you're coming from or where you see it in GB. Thanks, Stuart.
Thank you, Jonathan. And look, it's always a pleasure speaking after Peter. You start the evening with being given 3 to 5 minutes to respond to Peter. Peter then runs 10 minutes over. So by definition, I reckon I got about 2 minutes. But look, there is so much in what Peter said that I agree with. There's bits that I think we would challenge each other on. But I think in essence, what is being highlighted here is the importance of productivity. And I think one of the challenges for me, and I see actually somebody's picked it up in the chat, is this is almost this challenge between productivity and the environment, as if they're two totally separate things. And my big take from what Peter said, it's something that we've been talking a lot about, is look, there is an economic imperative to improve our productivity. We should all be seeking to do that, and we should all be seeking to do more of that. But actually, it is an absolute symbiotic relationship with the big issue of society, which is climate change. And I believe that if we don't, as a farming industry, respond to that big issue of society, ultimately, we will lose that license, if you like, to farm the land. I really fear that if we don't address climate change, if we're not seen as part of the solution, then actually we will put ourselves in a really difficult place. So that's why I always approach this through the lens of net zero. And ultimately, what do we mean by that? And I think Peter touched on this, but didn't, I don't think focused enough on it, is about what does productivity mean for me, okay? Me, the farmer. And what it means in very simple terms for me is making the very best use, the most efficient use of what are my resources. Now, I have heavy North London clay, exactly the same as Peter's. I'm going to claim mine's heavier than his, but we can dispute that one day. But also we look at resources too often as one-dimensional. We forget the fact that the human being, the farmer, is also a resource. And I think that fits very much into Peter's point about both people and he touched on mental well-being, but also about training, also about investment. And we need to invest in us as people, as well as invest in all those other things we know will drive productivity improvements, whether that be nutrition, whether that be genetics, whether that be new equipment, whether that be improved grassland. But ultimately, it is about looking at all of our resources and getting the very best out of them. And for me, being a farmer in this part of the world, if I could be a farmer anywhere in the world, this is where I would be a farmer going forward. Now, yes, we've got some big political challenges. Yes, we've got some big challenges around trade and lots of other things. But we also have some of the best natural resources that are available to agriculture anywhere. If I look at the depth of some of our soils, if I look at the simple fact that it rains, that potentially is our biggest competitive advantage going forward. Peter talked about the drains on his farm, and it's a really important point. If you were to farm anywhere in the world, and I've recently come back, not that recently actually, sorry, I'm not traveling at the moment, but relatively recently came back from California, from South America, spent a bit of time in Western Australia. If you were in those parts of the world where you're short of water, you would much rather farm here. Now, at times we got too much water and other times we got too little, and it's often in the wrong place. But by using those resources, those limited resources, to their most efficient, I think we have huge, huge opportunities. There's a last point I wanted to touch on, and Peter talked a lot about data, and he's absolutely right. And we can't improve something unless we can measure it. But the data on my farm is not the important point here. The important point, and we all get quite precious about data. I do, lots of people do, that I'm not letting anyone have my data because it has some value. The reality is my data has no value until it is put with other people's data. It is started to be pulled, it is started to be compared. And it's something we need to be better at as an industry, and we need to be much more collaborative. But that's not just about collaborating with each other. And Jonathan touched in the introduction of some of my background, which goes slightly beyond farm gate. We have got to be way better at collaborating up and down supply chains. We've got to get to a point where the supply chain understands that it has levers that can act both as pushes or pulls to help improve our productivity. So a simple one, and I'm not picking on any particular sector, but I'll pick on the one I know reasonably well. The fact that the biggest financial pull in terms of how we classify carcasses today relates back to an incentive to design the perfect carcass for an intervention store, rather than the perfect carcass for today's consumer or today's challenges of net zero or grassland efficiency or whatever it may be, is outdated. We've got to work all the way through the supply chain so that the messages I get on my farm are reinforcing the fact that I think we have some of the best natural resources in the world. I think we farm in some of the best places in the world. If I was to produce ruminant livestock on our grasslands, I can't think of anywhere better to do it. But we've got to get better at improving ourselves, all of us. As Peter says, and he's absolutely right, at least 50% think we're in the top 10%. Peter knows he's in the top 10%. That's why he keeps using the figure. But for all of us, I think productivity is an absolute opportunity. I think it is a fundamental opportunity for us to address that big change, which is our bit to climate change. And I think probably, Jonathan, I've now gone over my time by about the same percentage as Peter went over his. So yeah, Peter's even just texted me to tell me that. So look, that I'll rest it there. Plenty of time for questions, I hope, Jonathan. And it's a pleasure to join you all.
No problem. Thank you, Stuart. I was desperately trying to mute you there, but it wouldn't work. But no, thank you. Always good to listen to you. I'm going to hand over to Nick now. And Nick, perhaps if you can just respond even from your perspective in the commercial world, that would be superb. So thank you.
All right, Jonathan, thanks very much. And obviously, thanks, Jason, for the invitation. I have to say it was a real experience and a pleasure working the Food and Drink Sector Council with Peter. And he was a real leading voice at the table with respect to agricultural productivity. So everything he spoke about there, it comes from a genuine place because I've been listening to him speaking at many levels for a number of years. Now, listen, for most of you who won't know me, I'm a farmer's son myself from a dairy farm in the southeast of Ireland in Wexford, married to a dairy farmer's daughter. My brother's milking cows at the moment down in Wexford. So I come from a farming background. As Jonathan said, I've been lucky enough to work in agri-foods for 25 years now, working with the Kerry Group and Glanbia, and for the last almost 5 years now with Dale Farm here in Northern Ireland and the UK. Look, what I want to maybe just add to, I don't want to repeat what's been said by the two speakers already, and I'm conscious of time. Just talk about the application of what Peter was talking about in our business here in Dale Farm. So from our perspective, productivity is essential. Look, you can't be running a dairy cooperative and not quickly understand that this is a very, very tight supply chain. I mean, the margins for farmers are razor tight. The margin for processors are equally razor tight. And this is an industry where productivity is essential. And I suppose it's a dangerous topic, Jonathan, to try pontificate and tell your farmer owners how best to run their business. But this is genuinely a reflection of what we've been at for the last 2 years in Dale Farm to implement some of the findings of the Agricultural Productivity Work Group. So for us, you start with the big issue for farmers, and the first big issue is time, not enough of it. But we've focused on some of the key drivers here of productivity, and they're herd health, fertility, feed efficiency, and milk from forage. And our key objective here is to improve profitability. And to pick up on Stuart's point, yes, absolutely, it's a symbiotic relationship between economic and environmental sustainability. What most farmers will tell you, you can't be green until you're in the red. So what we're trying to do here is to drive profitability. And what we've done is we've listened to our farmers. We had a farm survey back in 2017. 30% of our farmers regularly benchmarked, which means 70% don't. And then we realized we held a lot of data in Dale Farm on milk solids, quality, and obviously their price. In our dairy herd management business, we had cow numbers, calving index, and replacement rates. And then from a United Feeds business, we had obviously their usage of food or of feed and the price that they paid per ton. So when we looked at trying to coordinate all that together and work with our farmers in a proactive way, we decided to work with Kingshay independent consultants to calculate a very simplistic margin over concentrate or margin over feed, and to try drive profitability on that index. Some of the dominant factors that affected productivity, look, you will have heard all this before, and again, it sounds as if we're pontificating. It all starts with the soil, very important. Forage quality is key. Grazing and silage quality is a huge bearing on feed efficiency, which is directly related to the productivity and the profit that comes from the forage. One of the things that we did then was we worked with about 16% of our membership, took on a pilot scheme just over a year ago, and we've proactively worked at managing profitability through the margin over feed initiative. It's been very successful. Our findings to date are that we've found significant opportunities for profitable growth. And that's the encouraging thing for me. So there's massive opportunity here when we work with the data. So just to give you some of the range of our top performers down to our bottom performers in the 16% that we're working with. Our feed cost pence per litre ranges from 5 pence per litre to 12.3 pence per litre. And the margin over profitable, over purchase feed per litre in pence per litre ranges from 23.58 to 13.46 with the bottom half. So you can see that there's massive opportunity for profitable growth when we start looking at how we manage feed efficiency. And in a lot of cases, and I'm saying this as the manager of a feed company, overfeeding animals was a big part of the productivity gain. So look, again, at the risk of pontificating, what we're finding in our scheme, like we're hoping to run it for 2 to 3 years because we're learning as we go, and you really need 12 months data before you can start speaking knowledgeably. You know, there's a great momentum in Dale Farm, and we have a key objective here of helping our farmers find that extra bit of profitability, because we see it as essential to sustainability, economic sustainability, as well as environmental sustainability. Just a final comment on the Agricultural Productivity Work Group. We're still looking at implementing a lot of those findings into the ecosystem here in Northern Ireland. Delighted to say that Wesley Aston from the Ulster Farmers Union now is on the Agricultural Productivity Task Force, and he's one of the driving members of that. And we're looking at bringing a unique perspective of that task force into Northern Ireland over the coming months.
Thank you very much, Nick. Appreciate that. And last but not least, Victor, I'll just ask you to give the NI perspective as well from the farming side of things.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Jason, for the invite tonight. Yeah, I'm not going to keep long. I just take one issue with Stuart Roberts. You're farming in their own country. If you farmed here, you wouldn't want to farm anywhere else. However, yeah, I've been asked to address some of the challenges facing Northern Ireland farmers. Look, I'm not going to spend all night talking about the challenges we're in at the minute, but, you know, COVID, the vaccine, there's a vaccine coming, the end's in sight. But what has COVID done for us? It has changed the value of farmers and the public's opinion. We were changed from someone who was seen as not needed to someone who are recognised as essential workers. And like, how much publicity would it have not taken to got that change? So farmers have won out of that. The other big one at the minute, Brexit and trade flows. And all I would say is, you know, trade flows can change with regulations. Regulations can change trade flows. The Trade and Agriculture Commission was mentioned. I'm going to let you into a paragraph that's going to be in the final report. The vision to be included in this Commission's final report. We want an ambitious UK trade policy which contributes to a global farming and food system that is fair and trusted by all its participants, including farmers, businesses, and citizens, from source to consumption. Our food should be safe, healthy, affordable, produced in a way which does not harm the planet, respects the dignity of animals, and provides proper reward for those involved in its production. I think there's a lot in that paragraph. Yeah, look, if we hadn't Brexit and we hadn't COVID, what will be the big challenges facing agriculture here today? And undoubtedly, it'll be one thing. It will be the environmental pressures that's coming down the road to us. We in Northern Ireland are not leaving Europe. We're in this European zone. So the farm to fork strategy will apply to Northern Ireland. And you may ask, what's that? 25% of EU production to be organic by 2030, reduction of fertilizer usage by 20%, reduce the overall use of pesticides by 2030, reduce the sales of microbials by 50%, and net zero by 2050. So we have plenty of challenges ahead. The big challenge for Northern Ireland, if I put it into my own words, is farming sustainably while increasing output, with less tools in the toolbox to do the job. We're working with a raft of new environmental legislation. But I think what we've got to do is tell our story better to the public. Our farming family system in Northern Ireland has a lot going for it. And sometimes we're in danger of not highlighting it enough. We definitely in the last 20 years have been neglectful. We produced a product. We thought when we got it to the end of the lane, that was the end of our involvement with it. We need to tell our story better. We need to educate our environmental NGOs who are very good at talking the talk, but who've never had to walk the walk. It's our farmers that have walked the walk. We need to measure emissions, measure them by net global warming. And I think net NFU in England, if I want to criticise you, maybe jumped a wee bit quick in talking about emissions rather than net global warming, because again, that is the effect that we need to stop. Farmers may have to change. We may have to change enterprises. We definitely have to increase our productivity. Those who adapt will thrive, and those who adapt first will thrive better. We need to deliver gains in reducing ammonia, which is a big thing in Northern Ireland, by tackling our low-hanging fruit first. There's a lot of talk at the minute on a grant scheme out for low emission spreading. Unfortunately, our beef industry tries to say it's a dairyman's problem. But 36% of our emissions come from the dairy industry and 30% from our beef industry. So it's almost 50-50 on that. We need to increase our land management. It all starts with our soils, and soils has been mentioned here tonight before. We, I think, have a lot to learn about our soils. We've forgotten about our soils and the importance of our soils. We need to investigate mixed species swards and make sure that our soils and the living organisms in our soils are improved as we go forward. We need to wean our farmers off farming for subsidies and focus on outputs. We need generational change in Northern Ireland. We have a system here of Conacre where a third of our land is let on a yearly basis, which is bad for investing in the soil. We need fiscal measures from government and tax changes to enable this to happen. So, look, it's not all bleak. And I think I take out of tonight one comment from Peter Kendall: business as usual is not an option. And the other comment I would say is we have got to measure to change. So I'm not downbeat about the future, but doing the same old won't hack it.
That is great. Thank you very much, Victor. So listen, I've sort of been reading through the questions there as people have been speaking. We're not going to be short of questions tonight, it has to be said. So with apologies, we might not get through them all. And what I'm going to try and do is combine them into 2 or 3 sections. So there are 2 questions that have been sort of competing for the top at the minute, and it's actually Ryan McGuire's question has come out top there, and there's 2 or 3 questions related to that. So we'll deal with them first, and then we'll move on to Paul Fagan and talk through, and there's 3 or 4 related to that as well. But firstly, Ryan, we're going to need to teach you to ask a question that has 1 question in it, not 7. But I'm going to read it out, and then I'm going to throw it firstly to Peter, and then after that, if anybody else wants to comment, please feel free from the panel as well. So the question is, what should, firstly, the current viable target for livestock farmers be regarding carbon and carbon accountability? And they're also saying, is net zero a term that may be too difficult to interpret? Is it too much for farmers? What do you think the current benchmark should be for carbon? And what's the best way to establish it? And if you can remember all that, Peter, I'll be impressed.
Yeah, look, I don't know what the initial benchmark should be. And you look at, again, I think there's lots of confusing ways of measuring carbon at this moment in time. Do I think net zero is the wrong target? No, I don't. And when I look, my knowledge of your agriculture in Northern Ireland isn't massively detailed, but I know there's a big plant already coming together, pulling a load of the chicken litter together and using it through an AD plant, stripping nitrogen out. You know, I don't know quite how you do it, but the more people can come together and replace all your inorganic fertilizers with maybe treated, processed manures from the dairy, beef, the sheep sector, from whatever, however you put it together, the poultry sector as well. I still think it's doable. I think it's massively doable because we have the ability. Now, going back to the point about what the target, what the metrics should be, I implore upon the industry to try and come together and agree standardized measures. You know, we need to know that if we have hedgerows or woodland, what that proxy score is. We need to make it really simple as well, that a farmer hasn't got to wander around his farm with a measuring wheel for hours on end. It can't be beyond the wit of man now with satellite imagery to deliver a proxy of what your farms are doing at certain times of the year. And then with our recording of what we're doing, what we're applying, and what we're getting out of outputs, this should be doable, but it does need, and Stuart, you know, and the Ulster Farmers Union, there needs to be a common metric, even if it's simplistic initially, that then ratchets up over time. But we need to start aiming for it now and not saying it's too hard and putting it off for another day.
Thank you, Peter. I think, Stuart, you wanted to respond there too.
Yeah, I'll come in quickly, and I think I agree with Peter in terms of common matrix, because one of the problems we've got at the moment is we've done some assessments of the various different calculators out there, and they are wildly different. They look at different things, they value different amounts, and actually there are some pretty simple things we've got to get. And I think for me, actually with livestock production, I see us as a huge, huge positive here, so long as we are able to take account of sequestration and carbon storage, which some of the calculators don't even touch. So I think there's a massive debate to be had around here, but I think net zero is the right language. I think it's also, it is the language that society uses. And therefore, I think actually it does make us more relevant if we use their language. But in doing that, there are some huge complications, as you know, Jonathan, many others, about how do we categorize methane in comparison to CO2, GWP star versus GWP 100. But if we can get those right in this common matrix that Peter talks about, then I think actually livestock farming in this part of the world with our type of systems using the rumen to do what it does best, I think is a phenomenally successful story potentially.
Yeah, good, thank you. And just one question I'm going to throw out from Will Oliver, just tying on to the end of it, and I think you've already answered it, but he's sort of saying about benchmarking fairly against each other, but he's also saying there's website calculators out there. Are they really a true reflection of what's happening on farm? What's your thoughts on that, Stuart?
Some and some. So there's about 100 out there, of which we have assessed them all. We think at the moment there's probably about 3. I'll put a paper we've done in the chat, Jonathan, that people can pick up. We think there's 3 that are head and shoulders above the others. But even those 3, there is still room for improvement. And what we're doing at the moment is working with any company of this area to make sure it includes the things that we think are important. For example, 2 of the 3 don't include sequestration, which rules out Peter's hedgerow point, which is actually quite an important point before we even get into grassland or the other bits. So, but I'll put something in the chat, Jonathan.
I just pick up then on following on from that. Then there's another question there from John Martin. Do you expect, or when do you expect there to be a UK carbon trading scheme?
Yeah, I think we're pretty close to it. I think one of my worries when it comes to carbon is that if agriculture doesn't move with pace, then actually others will grab the value that is on our farms. The carbon, I see it as having a huge potential value, but I also see it as very quickly disappearing if other people move quicker than we do. So actually we are talking to some guys in the city. There's lots of people around at the moment on this, and I think you will see this debate, John, move fairly quickly over the next months and years.
Okay. We're going to change tack a little bit now to answer Paul's question. Now, it's not so much a question as more of a statement, but I think it does raise some good issues and it needs a response. And I'm going to tie that in as well with one of his other questions. So essentially, Paul is saying production is vanity, profit is sanity. I've farmed all my life under a system where we're squeezed to produce more and more for less. Farmers and the soil are being damaged, required to be probably unsustainably profitable or unimaginably profitable, and there are powerful processors and retailers. We need to be properly paid to produce food in a balanced, less intensive, more sustainable manner, and the true cost of food needs to be passed back to the primary producer. And I'm going to tie that in with another comment he has made as well, which was basically along the lines, it's so far down now I'm struggling to find it, but essentially what he was saying was, the more data recording, the more benchmarking, the more squeezing there's going to be of the farmer, because the processors use it to squeeze back the price. I'm actually going to throw that to you, Nick, if that's all right to begin with, because I know we'll have a number of views on that, and maybe then Peter after that.
Look, on a serious note, look, we understand that's an issue, and that there's a mistrust that the processor here is only trying to really understand the real profitability to squeeze the supply chain more. It couldn't be further from the truth. If you take Dale Farm, for example, we are a farmer-owned organization, very much see the world through the farmer's lens. They're the people who own our business. And at the end of the day, if we don't have sustainable profitability at our farms, there isn't a Dale Farm. It's really, really simple. And that's why we've invested ourselves. We're a low margin business, 2 to 3% a year, but we've invested in this productivity drive that we're doing because we see it as very strategic and very, very important to the future of our business. And what we're trying to portray here is that, this is your friend. The data that we're uncovering here and that we're working with this 16% of our milk pool, it's helping our farmers be more profitable. It's as simple as that. And that, frankly, makes us a more sustainable business. And we're not going to those farmers and saying, because you're more profitable, you can afford to take a lesser milk price. It's far from that. But we have a big job in communicating that effectively, Jonathan, and that's a big responsibility that I take myself, that, the farmer has to trust that this is their business, right? And we're doing this on their behalf.
Mm-hmm. And I'm going to actually just, Peter, ask you to come in, because I know you have strong views on this. You farm sort of both ways. You have the arable, you have the chicken. You have strong views on benchmarking and data recording.
Yeah, look, I spoke at the Institute of Ag Management a few weeks ago and got a bit of a kicking on Twitter on exactly that message, that the more we share data. There'll be two responses to that, and I'll come back to the input one as well, if I may. I think I'm right in saying that the sector that's seen most growth in UK agriculture in the last 20 years would be broiler chickens. And that sector is most integrated, most sharing of inputs, of data, of performance measurement, and setting managed margins. So the people who have been engaged in that, in bearing their soul, have seen, yes, their price go down, but their margin go up because they've collaborated through a very, I think, sophisticated, integrated supply chain. It takes a hell of a mindset change. My brother has been leading on the arable side for some time. He really, really didn't like the idea of the integrated supply chain taking so much out of our control, but now he's seen the profitability. He's changed his mind quite quickly. The second piece of evidence I would submit would be the Tesco's designated supply chain. And Stuart Roberts is probably more up to date with this than I am now, but I still think dairy farmers bite their hands off to get to be a Sainsbury's or a Tesco's or a Waitrose designated supply chain. Yes, they share their data, but they can plan. They can go to their bank manager. They can say that this is what I'm going to return, this is what my margin is, and I can invest and grow my business. So I do think there's some really strong evidence of where this happens, you get positive results. There was a comment about production being vanity. I think I added to the list that Jonathan and I put together in the slides that actually productivity could be producing less, but by reducing your inputs by even more. And I do think we're going to have to choose the system that works best for us, but that net zero challenge should hang over everything we do. I just don't think we can dictate that we must be paid what we think we need for a certain farming system. I've always believed, and you know, I know exactly how the challenges and the tight ropes the representative bodies tread. And I believe in markets, and we have to make sure we provide what the market wants, and it is competitive. We're fortunate that we are by and large an island, and food has to be shipped here, which gives us a head start. God knows what Brexit will deliver if they finally make their minds up. But we do need to be, I think, price, you know, that's why integrated supply chains are so great, because you get round that price taker, you're just taking the bucket shop price.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. I'm just slightly tied into that. We're going to deal with Cormac McCurvey's question there, but I'm going to throw that to both just very quickly to Stuart and to Victor. Cormac has basically said he totally agrees with regard to benchmarking. It's effective in the pig, poultry, mushroom sector, more limited in dairy farms, but little uptake in beef and sheep. The simple question to Stuart and Victor very quickly is, how do we encourage perhaps the less extensive sectors to take up assessment of performance and to measure and to provide data?
Shall I go first, Victor?
Yeah, visitor first.
I think, well, look, if I'm a visitor to Northern Ireland, this is the easiest journey I've ever had, Victor, but not the most enjoyable in terms of presence. The first thing is we need to demonstrate what it can do. And I think actually there's a big chunk there of responsibility on the supply chain. I think we've also got two other things that always get thrown at us when we start talking about sharing data. One is the security of that data. People are petrified that by giving data, they'll lose security of it. And I think actually you don't necessarily, but I think there is just that fear. And the other thing is a fear that somebody else will extract the value from that data. Well, actually, my data sat by itself doesn't actually have any value. It's only when it's combined with other people's data that it has value. But I think this goes back to something that Nick touched on. And I think that the entire supply chain then needs to start to demonstrate to farmers how everyone can get value out of that data that will help back on farm gate. You know, when I look at the beef industry, you know, looking at how we can get better consistency, which may drive an efficiency in a factory, but actually how that could then be rewarded back at farm gate. And if we can show what can be done by it, then I think actually there's some real wins for everyone. At the minute, it's all a bit hypothetical because nobody's prepared to start to show some of those wins.
Thank you, Stuart. And Victor, I'm just going to throw another question from William Sheridan into you as well. If you can't measure it, you can't manage it. Why is there a reluctance in Northern Ireland, in particular the beef and sheep industry, to embrace performance recording? Because I think the two are related. So if you could quickly comment there.
First of all, you know, the beef and sheep sector traditionally has been the slowest to take this up. Maybe it's because they have been the sectors that's most reliant on subsidy. In my job as a deputy president, where we went around all the committees, there was a striking difference with the committees you sat on. And I don't want to be at with some of our committees, but the striking difference was if you sat in the poultry committee, they didn't grumble about price. They didn't grumble. They were measuring the things and getting on with what they could do. You sit in the dairy committee, they're obsessed with what one processor is playing against another. You sit in the beef and sheep committee, they're obsessed about subsidies, and the health farming committee even more so. And I think we need to take a long look inside our own farm gate. We need to measure what we're doing from grass production. I remember I went to a couple of years ago, went to Loch Gall to an event that yourselves ran down in Alfby, where there's two lumps of grass, what the average dairyman produced and the average beefman produced, and it was striking. Yeah. I'm not sure of the figures, but something like the average dairyman's producing 8 or 10 tonne dry matter per hectare. The top guys are 12 to 14 tonne per hectare. An average beef farmer produces 5 tonne per hectare. If there's not, the one good thing about that in the beef and sheep sector is you have huge room for improvement. And, you know, if we get our act together, we can improve. But I think the focus hasn't been enough on what we can change within our farm gate. You know, our A has been took off the ball. We used to be paid for the number of livestock we took, and then we're paid for the number of hectares we farmed. And that has took our eye off the ball as a beef and sheep industry, or as an extensive industry. So we need to try and do what we are doing better. You know, one thing that we found here in our own business, you know, with the dribble bar, we're having better worm counts within our ground, just simply with balanced spreading. You know, and there's things, everybody looks at the negatives. We need to look at the positives. Secondly, on the Williams question on why there's not more use made of figures and livestock, yeah, that actually, if I go back 20, 30 years ago, there was a bigger desire to do that than there is now. But it is something that we need to do in livestock production. But I think there's maybe bigger things in our soils and our soil testing and maybe grassland management as much as there is on our livestock. For years, we were focused on maybe getting E grades out of our livestock, whereas we might have been doing better to have a carcass that fits that what the market requires, even if it wasn't so shapely an animal. But we are in Northern Ireland maybe a bit obsessed with that really good shaped beast, and it could be to our detriment.
Okay. What we're going to do now is just change tack for a wee minute. We will come back to the carbon thing in a minute, but there's an interesting question in here. It's actually asked to Peter, but we're going to ask Nick because I think it lies in your area of expertise in particular, Nick. But you know, where's the protein for the feed, whether it's chicken feed, whether it's dairy feed, coming from? Where do we expect it to be 3, 5, 10, maybe even 20 years time, Nick? What's your thinking on that?
Look, obviously at the moment it's a global business, international feed, and you know there's a constant strive for looking at efficiencies from proteins from around the world. What's becoming clearer is that the consumer is going to have more and more of a role on what type of feed we use, and will we be using non-GMO feed going forward? It's a possibility or it's a probability. And more, that's the conversation we're having with retailers. But I think that's a slowly evolving piece, you know. A lot will depend on Brexit, as we've touched on earlier. But look, obviously, if we're looking at really efficient feed overall, you want to have as much choice as possible to drive that profitability we spoke about earlier, you know.
Yeah. No, thank you. Peter, do you want to comment on that at all, or are you content enough on that? Because the next question.
Look, just very briefly, one of our work streams in the Food and Drink Sector Council Agricultural Productivity is around insect protein, and of course, you know, I know there's a farmer not very far from me near Cambridge who's already using insects in his poultry diets already as an experimental basis on a limited amount, because the EU rules don't allow it. So I think it's part of an experiment. But look, you know, I know there's been enormous investment in northern France. I think 240 million euros into 100,000 tons a year insect protein source. So I think this is gathering a pace. And you know, yes, it's allowed to be used in agriculture at the moment, not in ruminants. So you know, I think this is watch this space territory. But I do think the uproar, the media attention you're getting to destruction of the Amazon, I think a bit like many things you see now, change happens very quickly, and I think there's quite a build-up of pressure on this move.
Peter, you may keep your mute off, because I have another question for you to throw firstly to you, and then I think perhaps Nick will, if you don't mind, can comment on this as well. But I'm throwing two questions together. Pat Maher's question is basically, hi all, in the event of added value to agri-food produce due to environmental sustainability measures, how can we ensure there's an even distribution of this added value across the supply chain? And I'm going to tie that in as well with the next one, because I think it's interesting and it's linked. Is there a conflict between improving farm productivity and reducing the carbon footprint of your farm? So there's a sort of concept there of, you know, environmentalism or improving carbon costing us money. Is that the case? Is it not? And how do we share it out?
Yeah, look, the first thing is this could be an hour's debate in itself. You know, we're talking about, you know, you really are talking about the crux of the future of farming, almost to a degree. When I look at my own farm, and I can't be too generous about this, I think there is ways of actually being smarter around sustainability and actually more profitable, and that's the holy grail I'm trying to unlock. And you know, for fear of getting too drawn into the detail of my business, I look at my carbon footprint. I look at diesel, I look at inorganic fertilizer, and I look at my soya for the chicken enterprise. You know, I'm heating my sheds with renewable energy. I'm desperately looking for a synergy, an interlink, a circular way of using those resources to actually make my business more sustainable and more profitable at the same time. Whether I get rewarded for that in the marketplace, I hope so. I can't count on it, but I think, you know, we're already seeing, one, it might open up your route to market. You know, Nick would be better versed on this than me, but it could well be that, if you want to be supplying Waitrose, I think Waitrose have already said they want to be net zero on their beef supply by 2030. If they are the best payers in the marketplace and you're doing it, then that's a reward. What I can't see is, if it becomes the norm, you won't get so much reward. But if we can be ahead of the game, and by using our resources more efficiently, we're more profitable to start with, that premium isn't so vital. In a perfect world, we save money, we become more productive at home, and we get rewarded because of that at the same time. And that would be the holy grail, obviously, which I'll be looking for.
Thank you, Peter. And Nick, can I ask you to comment, just as somebody who's leading a big farm organisation which is selling? Different markets want different things, but do you see an advantage? Will you be able to drive progress over time through improved environmental practice?
Well, look, what we're keeping an eye on at the moment, Jonathan, is like you could almost divide it into two parts. There's no doubt that the biggest impact on environmental sustainability will be in the farm. And look, myself and Victor, we were only a couple of weeks apart, we both visited the Devonish farm down in Doubt in County Meath a number of weeks ago. And look, what struck me walking around the fields there was there's a real business case for the farmer, I think, in time. And we take into account carbon sequestration and the trading of carbon credits in time. And look, what we're hopeful of is that if we build that in the right way, that we can turn farmers from being the problem into being the solution here. And they should be paid for that. And I think the way to get an economic model through that is through carbon trading. And our friends in Devonish seem to be very, very clear that that is a realistic and medium-term proposition. With respect to retailers, I think it's a slower burn, frankly. And what we have to be careful of here is that we've got to make sure that we've got efficiencies and economies of scale that we don't jeopardize across the supply chain as well. So it's fine having 5 or 6% of the Waitrose population looking for a value add, but if the other 95% of the consumers aren't convinced yet, that can end up being a challenge rather than being an opportunity. So I see it coming, frankly, but I think it's more a medium term. Peter, I've got teenagers in the house here, and that's all they talk about at the moment. So I can see it's definitely a trend that's coming. But if I was being commercial about it, I'd say the first commercial opportunity here is probably at the farm and carving it out there as from a carbon trading perspective.
What I'm going to do, we have so many questions that we just aren't going to get through them all. So we'll be sort of trying to take the very high level questions here, which deal with a number of issues. So with apologies, a number of you aren't going to get your specific questions answered tonight. But what I'm going to do is perhaps take 2 more questions, and then we will hand over basically to James and Sam just to sum up, if that's okay. But there's one question I want to throw out here because it's come up several times. And again, probably I'm going to land it probably with, well, maybe actually quickly start with Stuart and then move on to Peter. And if Nick, you want to comment, feel free on that. But what role do you see regenerative agricultural principles playing in reducing our carbon footprint and meeting ambitious targets? And it's a very important statement made there. Then our soil is our most important asset, and we're losing it. So maybe Stuart, do you want to quickly comment and then hand over to Peter?
Yeah, and I pick up what Victor said earlier about the importance of soils, and I absolutely agree. I think for me, I get slightly nervous when we look at individual farming systems, because in the past some of them have been treated more like religions than anything else. But actually, if you look at the fundamentals of regenerative agriculture, if you look at the use of mixed farming, if you look at the world where Peter and I both inhabit, we are seeing more livestock coming back into our parts of the world. Why is that? That's because of the soils, that's because of whole farming systems. And we talk about a healthy, balanced diet. And actually going forward, we need healthy, balanced farms. And I think that's what it's about. And for me, it's not about any one magic bullet, but it is about using the best we know to improve and make the most of the resources we've got. And Peter touched there about min-till and various other things. And I think we're all looking at how we farm. I've brought a lot more livestock back onto my farm. We were entirely cereal production through the 80s, 90s. And I see, regenerative agriculture, I see playing an important role.
I think Stuart's absolutely right that it's names or titles for systems that can get misleading. So if we're saying how we manage the soil, how we use the soil to absorb carbon, boy, do I get that. I think I said to you when we chatted the other week, Jonathan, about the film, the Netflix film, Kiss the Ground, which is, you know, doing great things in the United States at the moment. A lot of very provocative, annoying language for a conventional farmer like me, but stuff that really makes you think. And as you look around different systems, you know, it might be that actually we have years where we don't crop whole areas, that we do manage our soils with a preservation of worms and structure in a way that we haven't done in the past. And I was joking with Stuart earlier on that, you know, one of the beauties of the COVID shutdown rules is a bit of shooting is allowed as a sport at the moment. So I've been out for you know, I've got farmers who will shout at me almost to a point of anger that they must go ploughing, and they've ploughed for millennia, and ploughing is going to be the way forward. However, there is a growing movement, I think, that understands that how we build that regenerative system in the soil is going to be important. And am I seduced by it? Even at the age of 60, I'm actually quite excited by it. Stuart, who's an organic farmer, will think, God, what's happened to Peter? He'll be wearing sandals before long. But actually, I'm really excited by how we farm differently and review it afresh.
Thank you. And I'm going to just ask one last question, and just to you, Peter, if that's right, before I hand over firstly to James and then Sam. What is the best way to get farmers heading down this route? Is it carrot or is it stick?
Christ, that's a great one to finish with, isn't it? Look, I think we need to be brave here. I think the magnitude is so great. I think there needs to be some stick as well. And Stuart will probably be muttering down the end, and Victor will be muttering down the end saying he hasn't got an election to win, or he's got nothing, you know, he hasn't got members to go and stand in front of next weekend. I just think the scale of this is so enormous, what's coming down the road to us, that we've got the opportunity with changing support systems to make, however, whether it's heavily induced or conditional, you know, I think that's a moot point. But I would be driving people to start measuring. I would be starting getting people together for that mental health issue, get farmers together, sharing ideas, sharing problems. And my last point, if I could be self-indulgent, is, and the reason for this is actually we need to solve these problems. We need to address things that we can do for ourselves. As farmers, waiting for someone else to solve problems for us never works. And I think that because of what's going on, yes, get governments to use the influence they've got to drive change. Yes, incentivize people as well. Stuart, Victor, it also needs, because of the scale of the challenge, tough leadership. And I think I've seen that from the agricultural organizations. The net zero is brilliant. But boy, this is just a matter. Farmers have got to grab this for themselves. I think it's quite a worrying but exciting time. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you, Peter. And you know, the really lovely thing is there's no right of reply there as well now, because we're just literally moving straight on. Firstly to James. If you just don't mind just giving your quick view as a farmer, and then to Sam, and then I'll sum up just quickly at the end.
There we go. Yeah, I think you know, I think all the speakers tonight have been fantastic, and I agree with pretty much every single point everyone's had. But I think the only point that I'd like to put on it really is, you know, as an industry, we need to change. You know, change is imminent. And it's how we do that change. And just looking at from probably a personal point of view, I think, you know, from a mental health point of view, when we're in a good frame of mind ourselves, you know, I think we can adapt change. But I think, you know, when we're perhaps struggling, or it's a horrible day, or things aren't going right, we're not really receptive to change. And I think perhaps as an industry, we really need to work together to get that feel-good factor. We need to probably look at ourselves in the mirror and go, why aren't we changing? Why aren't we adopting change? You know, I think the industry has got all the answers. I think there's probably more information out there now. We know the farmers that are doing it well. We know really how we should farm, but it's that confidence to put change into our business. And yeah, I think, yeah, we need to just get that feel-good factor back into our thinking, really.
Thank you very much. And indeed, it must agree with James. The speakers were excellent this evening. But I think all the answers we have had this evening have been portrayed in the events we've had over the past six meetings. We first of all talked about mixed species sports and the soil, which really has come out tonight as one of the key factors for environmental change and public perception, which is very important. The public need to realise that farmers are not the enemy. We're producing a high quality product, and we're showing them the rich tapestry of our countryside. Like Ireland's 40 shades of green are not 40 shades because it's left to go to wilderness. So that's a very important point. The second week we had animal health and welfare. Again, the public perception, how we treat our animals and how they're looked after is very, very important. Other parts in the world are horrendously treated with no animal welfare at all. And we don't want that sort of product, and that's up to Stuart and Victor. That's what we don't want any sort of those products coming into the UK. The next thing was John Gilliland and the Land of Doubt. We've all been there. Fantastic setup. Devonish are doing a marvellous job. Net carbon farming, and a net carbon farming balance. I like the word balance because balance is left out of a lot of carbon audits. You know, they talk about all the bad things that farmers produce, but they don't talk about the carbon sequestration and grasses and hedges and trees and mixed species swards. So that's very important. So and then not to end it there, Nigel Scullin spoke about meat eating quality, which really to my heart is one of the things. If you can't produce something that people like to eat and come back again, there's no point in doing it. So what are we doing on this farm to try and mitigate? We would be a very intensive beef farm, as James Evans is a more extensive, but we both have the same goals at the heart of it. I have specialist markets and contracts, and so is James. I'm using bulls with high EBV values. I increased my carcasses from 380 to 410 in one street with a good bull. You know, that's efficiency. You know, if we're to compete with the likes of the Netherlands, who have a growth of 3.5%, you need to be doing things like that there. You need to have cattle that have a carcass gain of upwards of a kilo, not 0.4 of a kilo. You use net feed efficiency bulls and rams. We had a question earlier on about why people aren't recording. It's the easiest way to improve the quality of your stock and your output is to use that type of technology. We're trying to improve the organic matter in our soils. We're using more farmer manure. Data was talked about this evening. We benchmark, we use different various systems. We're measuring grass. We benchmark our grass. We're using an integrated beef system as well. We're trying that. We're vaccinations. We're using less antibiotics. So we're doing lots of things, and lots of wee things add up to big things. And that's what has come out of this whole series of talks that James and I have been involved in. It's been a pleasure to be involved in them all. May I thank Jason and Kerry and James Draper and Nigel for organising the whole thing. I think it's done a marvellous job, and we've had some very high-class speakers on. So thank you very much for listening to my elongated summary. Thank you, Jonathan.
No, thank you very much, Sam. You did well. First, just in conclusion, then, can I first say thank you again to our speakers. We genuinely appreciate you coming on. We know you're not paid. We know you don't have to give up an evening to come, but we also know that each of you are committed to a better industry. And actually, we've had a really good attendance tonight. I think probably the highest that there has been on this, just under 300, which is excellent. So hopefully your words are not wasted. And I do think Sam actually finished it up very well. They'll be saying, you know, lots of small changes add to lots of big things. And that's really, I suppose, where we need to go. So thank you for the summary as well for both James and Sam. And we've just got to say thank you again all for attending. And I see Santa's made an appearance as well there now as well. So happy Christmas to everybody. And thank you again for attending. Okay, all the best then.